Imagine standing in a courtroom believing you've already figured out how the day will end. Your attorney has negotiated a plea agreement. Your family is waiting outside. You expect to walk away with probation, or at least a lighter sentence. Then the judge begins reading the case file. Within moments, the atmosphere changes. The courtroom falls silent. The defendant's confidence disappears. And everyone realizes this hearing isn't going according to plan. That scene has played out again and again inside Judge Raquel West's courtroom. Known for her calm but direct approach, Judge West doesn't rely on dramatic speeches or emotional reactions. Instead, she focuses on the evidence, the law, and the decisions that brought each defendant before the court. But some cases stand out even among hundreds of hearings. Cases involving repeat offenders who ignored multiple chances. Violent crimes that left entire communities shaken. Defendants who expected mercy, but discovered that a negotiated agreement still required judicial approval. And moments where a single decision changed the course of a person's life forever. Today, we're taking a closer look at several of Judge West's most memorable courtroom moments. Not just what happened inside the courtroom, but the stories behind them. Because by the time these defendants stood before the bench, their cases had already taken months, and sometimes years, to unfold. Police investigations. Victims seeking justice. Evidence collected piece by piece. Plea negotiations behind closed doors. And finally, the moment when everything came down to one hearing. Some defendants admitted responsibility immediately. Others hoped for another chance. A few believed the outcome was already decided. But as you'll see, Judge West repeatedly reminded everyone of one important truth. A plea agreement may be negotiated between prosecutors and defense attorneys, but the final decision still belongs to the court. Throughout this documentary, we'll revisit several real courtroom proceedings, examine the allegations presented in court, and explain why each hearing became significant. We'll also explore the legal process behind bond hearings, guilty pleas, probation violations, and sentencing, helping explain why some defendants were released while others remained behind bars. Some stories end with prison sentences, others end with another opportunity, and a few leave everyone inside the courtroom completely surprised. Let's begin with a case that looked routine at first glance, but quickly became one of the clearest examples of how repeated decisions can eventually catch up with a defendant. When second chances run out. If you've ever wondered why judges sometimes send a defendant to prison even after previously granting probation, the answer often comes down to one simple question. What happened after the court gave them another chance? Probation isn't the end of a criminal case. It's an opportunity. Instead of serving a sentence behind bars, the defendant agrees to follow strict conditions set by the court. Those conditions usually include regular meetings with probation officers, attending court-ordered programs, staying out of trouble, paying required fees, and avoiding any new criminal offenses. For many people, probation becomes a turning point. For others, it becomes another promise they fail to keep. One case that came before Judge Raquel West demonstrated exactly how repeated violations can completely change the outcome of an earlier sentence. The defendant had already received a significant break from the justice system. Instead of immediately serving time in a Texas state jail, multiple forgery convictions had resulted in probation, a chance to rebuild life outside prison walls while following the court's conditions. On paper, it looked like an opportunity most defendants hoped for. But over time, those conditions began piling up. Court records showed repeated failures to report to probation officers. Required rehabilitation and theft prevention programs weren't completed. Court fees remained unpaid. When the defendant finally returned to court, the hearing moved quickly. Judge West carefully reviewed each allegation one by one, ensuring the defendant understood every violation listed in the motion to revoke probation. There was no confusion, no misunderstanding. Each question required only one answer. True or not true? Again. True. Another violation. True. Another. True. One admission after another. By the end of the hearing, every major allegation had been acknowledged by the defendant. At that point, the focus of the courtroom shifted. This was no longer about whether the violations happened. The defendant had already admitted they did. Now the only remaining question was what consequence those admissions would bring. Judge West explained that each forgery conviction carried its own sentence. Rather than discussing emotions or personal opinions, she returned to the legal framework governing the case. Each probation term would be revoked, each sentence would be reassessed, and each would result in 12 months in a Texas state jail. For viewers unfamiliar with criminal sentencing, something important happened next. Instead of ordering the defendant to serve every sentence one after another, Judge West ruled that they would run concurrently. In practical terms, that meant the sentences would be served at the same time rather than stacked consecutively. Although the defendant lost probation and received prison time, the court still followed the negotiated agreement and applied the sentence according to Texas law. Before concluding the hearing, Judge West also reminded the defendant of another consequence many people overlook after a felony conviction. Federal and state law prohibits certain convicted felons from possessing firearms or ammunition. The court provided written notice explaining those restrictions and advised the defendant to discuss any questions with defense counsel. With that, the hearing ended. No dramatic outburst. No lengthy speech. Just another reminder that every condition attached to probation carries real legal consequences. But if that hearing demonstrated what happens after repeated probation violations, the next case raised a completely different question. What happens when a defendant pleads guilty, yet the judge still refuses to decide the sentence immediately? That answer would reveal another side of the criminal justice system, one many people never see until they're sitting inside a courtroom. The plea that changed nothing for many defendants. Pleading guilty is seen as the moment uncertainty comes to an end. After weeks or even months of negotiations, both sides finally reach an agreement. The defendant accepts responsibility, the prosecution recommends a sentencing range, and everyone expects the hearing to move quickly toward its conclusion. But sometimes entering a guilty plea is only the beginning. One hearing before Judge Raquel West demonstrated exactly why. The defendant stood before the court facing an aggravated assault with a deadly weapon charge, a serious felony under Texas law. Rather than taking the case to trial, he chose to plead guilty. Judge West carefully followed the same process she uses in every plea hearing. She confirmed that the plea was entered freely and voluntarily. She verified that the defendant had reviewed every document with his attorney. She made certain he understood the constitutional rights he was giving up by avoiding a jury trial. Then she turned to one of the most important parts of the agreement. The defendant had accepted what is known as a sentencing cap. Instead of agreeing to a fixed prison term, both sides agreed that Judge West could sentence him to any term up to 15 years. That distinction matters. Many people assume a plea agreement guarantees a specific sentence. In reality, some agreements simply establish the maximum punishment the judge may impose, leaving the final decision for a later hearing. Judge West explained this point in plain language. She reminded the defendant that she could impose the full 15 years, or something less. The final decision would depend on the information presented during sentencing. She also explained another right the defendant was giving up. Had he chosen a trial, a jury could have decided not only whether he was guilty but, if convicted, what punishment should be imposed. By pleading guilty, he voluntarily waived that opportunity. Only after confirming he understood every consequence did Judge West formally accept the plea. At that moment, many people watching might have expected sentencing to happen immediately. Instead, everything stopped. Judge West announced that she was postponing the sentencing hearing. Before deciding the punishment, she wanted the probation department to prepare a pre-sentence investigation report, often called a PSI. To someone unfamiliar with criminal courts, that might sound like a delay. In reality, it's one of the most important stages in felony sentencing. A pre-sentence report gives the judge a much broader picture than the criminal charge alone. It can include the defendant's background, employment history, education, criminal record, victim impact statements, mental health information, substance abuse history, and recommendations from probation officers. In other words, it helps the court understand not only what happened, but who the defendant is. Judge West encouraged the defendant to provide any information he believed might help his case. Character references, evidence of employment, family responsibilities, proof of rehabilitation, anything that might become relevant during sentencing. Then, just as the hearing appeared ready to conclude, the defense attorney made one final request. Would the court consider reducing the defendant's bond while waiting for sentencing? The request was brief. The answer was even shorter. Judge West looked directly at the defendant before delivering a firm response. With a sentencing cap reaching 15 years in prison, she was not willing to reduce the bond. There was no hesitation, no extended debate. The defendant would remain in custody while awaiting sentencing. But what happened next revealed something even more significant. Judge West reminded him that the court receives reports from the county jail describing an inmate's behavior while incarcerated. Every disciplinary write-up, every rule violation, every incident. Nothing remains hidden. She explained that those reports could influence how the court viewed the defendant when it came time to determine punishment. Then came a warning that echoed throughout the courtroom. If additional disciplinary reports appeared before sentencing, the defendant shouldn't expect favorable consideration. And she reminded him of something every defendant facing trial must remember. If negotiations failed, if the case ultimately went before a jury, the consequences could become even more severe. It was a quiet warning but a powerful one. Good behavior doesn't begin after sentencing. For many defendants, it begins the moment they're taken into custody. Because every decision they make, even inside the jail, can become part of the story the court considers before determining their future. And as the next hearing would prove, sometimes the most unexpected decision in a courtroom isn't the sentence. It's when a judge refuses to accept the plea agreement at all. The deal that fell apart for most defendants. Reaching a plea agreement feels like crossing the finish line. After months of negotiations, prosecutors and defense attorneys finally settle on a recommendation. Everyone enters the courtroom expecting the judge to approve the deal, sign the paperwork, and move on. But that's not how the system works. A plea agreement is exactly what its name suggests. An agreement between the prosecution and the defense. The judge is never required to accept it. One hearing before Judge Raquel West became a perfect example of that principle. The defendant had pleaded guilty to multiple counts involving child pornography. According to the agreement presented to the court, the recommendation called for deferred probation, financial penalties, and the dismissal of several additional charges. On paper, the deal appeared complete. The attorneys had done their jobs. The paperwork was finished. All that remained was the judge's approval. Judge West began reviewing the pre-sentence investigation report, a document prepared independently to help the court evaluate the appropriate sentence. As she read through the report, her expression changed. She paused before addressing everyone in the courtroom. Then she explained why this case stood apart from many others she had seen. This wasn't simply a situation involving illegal material downloaded from the internet. According to the facts discussed in court, the allegations involved the creation of abusive material involving a very young family member. That distinction changed everything. Judge West emphasized that the alleged victim wasn't an anonymous person somewhere else. The allegations described harm inflicted within the defendant's own family. The courtroom became noticeably quieter. The defendant attempted to respond. Before he could continue, Judge West interrupted. "Don't talk right now." It wasn't anger. It was control. She wanted the record to remain clear while she explained her reasoning. Then came the decision no one expected. Judge West announced that she was not comfortable accepting the negotiated plea agreement. In a single moment, months of negotiations lost their certainty. The recommended probation would not be approved. She explained that, based on the nature of the allegations described in the report, she simply could not support placing the defendant on deferred probation. Rather than forcing an immediate alternative sentence, Judge West chose another option. She rejected the agreement entirely. The attorneys would have another opportunity to negotiate. If they reached a different proposal, they could return to court. If not, a jury would ultimately decide the case. For many viewers, this moment highlights an important part of the justice system that often goes unnoticed. Judges are not passive participants. Even when both sides agree, the court has an independent duty to determine whether the proposed outcome serves justice under the law. That authority exists to ensure that every case receives individual consideration. Before ending the hearing, Judge West reminded everyone of exactly that. She told the defendant that she didn't have to accept probation simply because it had been negotiated. If no acceptable resolution could be reached, 12 citizens sitting in a jury box could decide both guilt and punishment instead. The defendant appeared surprised. He questioned whether the agreement hadn't already been accepted earlier in the process. Judge West calmly clarified the misunderstanding. The case had previously been reset for sentencing, not finally approved. Until the court formally accepted the recommendation, nothing was guaranteed. It was a reminder that every plea agreement remains subject to judicial review until the very last step. As the hearing concluded, the defense attorney addressed another issue. The defendant's family had believed he might be released that very day. Counsel explained that she had repeatedly warned both the defendant and his mother that release depended entirely on the judge's decision. Judge West acknowledged those conversations before making one final ruling. The defendant would remain in custody. No bond. No probation. No immediate release. Only additional negotiations, or a trial before a jury. As deputies escorted the defendant from the courtroom, one message had become unmistakably clear. Negotiating a plea agreement may open the door to a lighter sentence. But the final responsibility for protecting the integrity of the justice system always rests with the court. And in Judge West's courtroom, that responsibility isn't treated as a formality. It's treated as a duty. When mercy has limits, every bond hearing begins with one basic question. Should the defendant remain in jail while the case moves through the court system? Or can they safely wait for trial outside the jail under certain conditions? It's a decision that balances two competing interests. On one side is the defendant, who is presumed innocent until proven guilty. On the other is the safety of the community and the risk that the defendant may fail to appear in court. Few hearings demonstrate that balancing act better than the case of a young man, accused of aggravated assault with a deadly weapon. At first glance, the defense presented a familiar argument. The defendant was only 18 years old. He had lived in the same community most of his life. His parents were present in court and willing to help him if his bond were reduced. He had worked construction, cleaned apartments, and taken other labor jobs. According to his attorney, employment was waiting for him if he could simply get back home. The request seemed straightforward. Reduce the bond from $300,000 to $50,000. The defense argued that with electronic monitoring, strict supervision, and family support, the defendant could safely remain in the community while awaiting trial. Judge West listened carefully. She asked about his work history, his education, his living arrangements, his family's financial situation. One question after another, she gathered the details herself instead of relying solely on the attorney's arguments. Then the conversation shifted. Judge West asked whether this was truly the defendant's first encounter with law enforcement. It wasn't. As a juvenile, he had already been arrested. She asked another question. What were you arrested for? The answer came quietly. Marijuana possession. Then another question. Were you carrying a handgun? Again. Yes. That answer immediately changed the tone of the hearing, because the allegations now before the court also involved a firearm. According to prosecutors, the defendant and several other individuals allegedly followed a young woman home after she finished work late at night. When her boyfriend confronted the group, investigators alleged that he was shot. Those allegations had not yet been proven at trial, but for purposes of determining bond, they were serious enough to weigh heavily in the court's decision. The prosecutor argued that reducing the bond to $50,000 would not adequately protect the public. The circumstances, they argued, suggested a continuing danger involving firearms and violent behavior. Judge West then explained what concerned her most. It wasn't only the current allegation. It was the pattern. A prior arrest involving a handgun. Now another case involving a firearm. Combined with the fact that the alleged shooting occurred in the early hours of the morning, the court found the circumstances deeply troubling. Then Judge West delivered the statement that immediately caught everyone's attention. She looked directly at the defendant before saying she was tired. Tired of guns. Tired of people being shot. Tired of seeing communities repeatedly harmed by gun violence. It wasn't directed only at the young man standing before her. It reflected the frustration many courts face as violent firearm cases continue appearing on crowded criminal dockets. Her decision followed immediately afterward. The request to reduce bond was denied. The existing $300,000 bond would remain exactly where it was. However, Judge West also made it clear that if the defendant eventually managed to post bond, strict conditions would apply. He would be placed on GPS monitoring. He would remain under house arrest. His movements would be heavily restricted until the criminal case reached its conclusion. The hearing ended quietly. No raised voices.
No emotional confrontation.
Just another reminder that youth alone does not guarantee leniency when allegations involve serious violence. For many defendants, family support and future employment are important factors. But they are only part of the equation. When a judge believes public safety may be at risk, those factors often become secondary. And in this courtroom, Judge West made one thing unmistakably clear. Protecting the community would always remain her first responsibility. When a criminal record speaks for itself, not every courtroom hearing is filled with dramatic testimony or emotional exchanges. Sometimes the most powerful evidence is a defendant's own history. By the time one woman appeared before Judge Raquel West, the court already had years of records documenting repeated theft convictions. Each new offense wasn't viewed in isolation. It became another chapter in an increasingly familiar pattern. The hearing involved multiple theft cases, each carrying enhanced penalties because of prior convictions. Judge West carefully explained every charge. She reviewed the dates. She confirmed the earlier convictions. Then she asked the same questions she asks every defendant entering a guilty plea. Was the plea made freely and voluntarily? Did the defendant understand the agreement? Was she pleading guilty because she had actually committed the offenses? Each answer was short. Yes. The defendant also admitted that the previous theft convictions listed in the indictment were accurate. But the hearing didn't end there. Judge West turned to another file sitting on the bench. Months earlier, the same defendant had received deferred adjudication probation, a decision that allowed her to avoid a formal conviction if she successfully completed the conditions imposed by the court. For many defendants, deferred adjudication is one of the biggest opportunities the justice system can offer. Complete probation successfully, and the case may never end in a conviction. Fail to comply, and the consequences can be severe. Judge West began reading the alleged probation violations one by one. The first was perhaps the most significant. The defendant had committed another theft offense while already on probation. Then came another allegation, providing false identifying information. Another violation, failing to complete required community service. Another, failing to complete the court-ordered theft prevention class. Finally, the court addressed unpaid financial obligations ordered as part of probation. Each allegation received the same response. True. There was no dispute about the facts. No witnesses were needed. The admissions themselves established the violations. With every answer, the possibility of remaining on probation became increasingly unlikely. Still, Judge West didn't rush to impose punishment. Instead, she explained that sentencing would be delayed. The probation would be revoked, but before deciding the final punishment, the court wanted additional information through a sentencing hearing. That decision highlights something many people misunderstand about criminal court. Admitting guilt does not always mean sentencing happens immediately. Judges often pause the process to gather more information before deciding exactly how much punishment is appropriate. That extra time allows both the prosecution and the defense to present information that may affect the final outcome. For victims, it offers another opportunity to be heard. For defendants, it's often the last chance to demonstrate why they deserve leniency. As deputies escorted the defendant from the courtroom, the lesson was difficult to ignore. The justice system had already extended multiple opportunities, previous convictions, deferred adjudication, probation, rehabilitation programs. Instead of marking a fresh start, each opportunity had been followed by another violation. By the time the case returned to Judge West's courtroom, the focus was no longer whether another chance should be given. The question had become whether those earlier chances had already been exhausted. For repeat offenders, criminal history isn't simply background information. It becomes part of every future decision. Each conviction changes how prosecutors negotiate, how probation officers make recommendations, and how judges evaluate whether rehabilitation is still possible. It's one reason experienced judges often spend just as much time reviewing a defendant's past as they do discussing the newest charge. Because patterns matter. And sometimes the pattern tells the story long before the defendant says a single word. The detective who faced unexpected questions. Courtrooms are often viewed as places where prosecutors present evidence and defense attorneys challenge it. But every now and then, a hearing takes an unexpected turn. Not because someone confesses, but because careful questioning exposes weaknesses in a witness's testimony. One of those moments unfolded during a bond hearing, involving a defendant accused in the deaths of 4 people. The case had already attracted enormous attention. Years earlier, the defendant had been convicted, but that conviction was later overturned, meaning the legal process had to begin again. Now the court faced a difficult question. If the defendant was awaiting another trial, should he remain in jail, or should he be allowed out on bond? The defense argued that enough time had already passed. The defendant had spent nearly 7 years behind bars. He had no significant assets. Any bond would depend entirely on help from family members. His attorney suggested that a bond of $250,000 would be difficult but potentially achievable. The prosecution strongly disagreed. To support its position, the state called one of the lead detectives involved in the original investigation. The detective described the case as unlike anything the community had experienced in years. 4 people had been killed in a single incident near a college campus. According to his testimony, the scale of the violence alone demonstrated why releasing the defendant would pose a serious risk to public safety. He also expressed concern that someone facing such severe charges would have a strong incentive to flee if released. Initially, the testimony appeared persuasive. The courtroom remained focused as the detective explained the seriousness of the investigation. Then the defense attorney stood for cross-examination. Instead of arguing about the murders themselves, he asked something much simpler. Did you testify at the original trial? The detective answered honestly, no. Another question followed. Did you watch the trial? Again, no. The attorney continued. If the detective neither testified nor observed the day-to-day testimony presented before the jury, how much first-hand knowledge did he actually have about what happened inside the courtroom? The detective explained that although he helped prepare evidence and assisted the prosecution, he had not personally watched the witnesses testify. Then came another unexpected question. The attorney asked whether the detective knew the details of how the jury had reached its verdict during the first trial. The detective admitted he did not know those specific details. The exchange lasted only a few moments. There were no dramatic objections, no raised voices. Yet the impact was significant. The defense had successfully shown that the detective's opinions about the case were based primarily on his role during the investigation, not on first-hand observation of the trial itself. That distinction mattered because bond hearings require judges to evaluate the reliability and weight of every piece of testimony presented. It didn't erase the seriousness of the allegations. It simply reminded everyone in the courtroom that even experienced investigators can only testify about matters within their own personal knowledge. After both sides finished arguing, Judge West carefully explained her decision. She acknowledged the extraordinary nature of the allegations and the evidence she had previously heard while presiding over the original trial. Taking into account the seriousness of the accusations, the history of the case, and the arguments presented during the hearing, she concluded that bond should be set at $1 million. It was far above the amount requested by the defense. However, it also meant the defendant was no longer being held without any possibility of bond. Judge West added strict conditions. If the bond were ever posted, the defendant would immediately be placed under GPS monitoring and house arrest while awaiting trial. Those restrictions reflected the court's effort to balance constitutional rights with concerns about public safety. The hearing demonstrated something many people misunderstand about the criminal justice system. Winning one argument during cross-examination doesn't automatically determine the outcome. Even though the defense identified limitations in the detective's testimony, Judge West still considered the totality of the evidence, her familiarity with the case, and the seriousness of the allegations before making her ruling. In the end, neither side received everything it wanted. The defense obtained a bond where previously none existed. The prosecution secured a bond amount so high that release would remain extremely difficult. It was another example of how judicial decisions are rarely black and white. Instead, they often involve finding the narrow path between competing legal principles. Throughout these cases, one theme has appeared again and again. Some defendants asked for mercy. Others asked for another chance. Some believed a negotiated agreement guaranteed a certain outcome. But Judge Raquel West repeatedly returned to the same principle. Every decision must begin with the law and end with accountability. In the final chapter, we'll look at what these courtroom moments reveal about Judge West's judicial philosophy and why her courtroom continues to attract millions of viewers online. The lesson behind the verdicts after watching these cases unfold: it's easy to focus on the sentences, the bond decisions, or the dramatic courtroom exchanges. Those moments often become the clips that spread across social media, generating millions of views and countless opinions. But if you look beyond the headlines, a much clearer picture begins to emerge. These hearings weren't simply about punishment. They were about accountability. Throughout every case, Judge Raquel West followed the same methodical process. Before making any ruling, she confirmed that each defendant understood the charges against them, the rights they were giving up, and the consequences of their decisions. Whether someone was pleading guilty to a felony, admitting probation violations, or asking for a reduced bond, the court ensured that every answer was made knowingly and voluntarily. That consistency is one reason these proceedings attract so much attention. The outcomes may differ from case to case, but the process rarely does. One defendant received probation and later lost it after violating multiple conditions. Another entered a guilty plea expecting the process to move quickly, only to learn that sentencing required a much deeper review of their background. In another case, a negotiated plea agreement reached by both attorneys wasn't accepted, because the court concluded the proposed resolution wasn't appropriate under the circumstances presented. And in the bond hearings, Judge West repeatedly weighed two competing responsibilities. Every defendant is presumed innocent unless proven guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. At the same time, judges must consider public safety, the seriousness of the allegations, the likelihood that a defendant will return to court, and the potential risk to victims and the community. Those are not easy decisions. There is rarely an answer that satisfies everyone involved. Victims often want stronger punishment. Defendants hope for another opportunity. Families on both sides carry the emotional weight of every ruling. Yet the court's responsibility is not to make popular decisions. Its responsibility is to apply the law fairly and consistently. Another common thread throughout these hearings was personal responsibility. Several defendants had previously been given opportunities to avoid prison through probation or deferred adjudication. Those alternatives exist because the justice system recognizes that people can change. But those opportunities also come with expectations. Reporting to probation officers, completing required treatment programs, avoiding new criminal offenses, following court orders. When those obligations aren't met, judges must decide whether another chance is justified or whether accountability now requires a different outcome. That doesn't mean every defendant who appears before the court is beyond rehabilitation. In fact, Judge West often encouraged defendants awaiting sentencing to provide information about employment, education, family support, treatment efforts, or other evidence that could help the court understand the full picture before imposing punishment. The message was clear. Actions after an arrest can matter almost as much as the conduct that brought someone into court in the first place. Perhaps the biggest misconception these hearings dispel is the belief that plea agreements automatically determine the outcome of a criminal case. Again and again, Judge West reminded defendants that negotiated agreements remain subject to judicial approval. The court isn't simply there to sign paperwork. Its role is to independently evaluate whether the proposed resolution serves justice under the law. That responsibility sometimes means accepting an agreement. Other times, it means rejecting one and allowing the case to continue toward trial. It's a reminder that the courtroom isn't designed to produce dramatic moments for the internet. Its purpose is to resolve real legal disputes involving real people whose lives may be changed forever by a single decision. For viewers, these hearings also offer a rare opportunity to see the criminal justice system operating in real time. Instead of television dramas or fictional courtroom scenes, They reveal the careful questions, legal procedures, and measured decisions that shape every felony case. Whether you agree with every ruling or not, one thing becomes difficult to ignore. Judge Raquel West approaches every defendant with the same expectation. Take responsibility for your actions. Understand the consequences of your choices. And remember that every opportunity the court gives you comes with the responsibility to earn it. Thank you for watching. If you enjoy fact-based courtroom analysis and real criminal cases explained in a clear, balanced way, be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. We regularly cover significant courtroom proceedings, legal decisions, and the stories behind the headlines, all based on publicly available records and court proceedings. We'll see you in the next case. What happens after the verdict? When the judge finishes speaking, many viewers assume the story is over. The sentence has been announced. The bailiff escorts the defendant out of the courtroom. The next case is called, and the live stream moves on. But for everyone involved, that moment is rarely the end. In many ways, it's only the beginning. For defendants who receive prison sentences, another legal process immediately begins. They'll be transferred from the county jail to the Texas Department of Criminal Justice, where they'll be classified, assigned to a correctional facility, and begin serving the sentence imposed by the court. Some will become eligible for programs designed to improve education, vocational skills, or substance abuse treatment. Others may spend years trying to rebuild relationships that were damaged long before they entered the courtroom. For those placed on probation, life doesn't simply return to normal. Probation is a sentence. Comes with rules. Missing appointments, failing drug tests, refusing counseling, committing new offenses, or ignoring financial obligations can all bring a defendant back before the same judge. Several of the cases we've covered today demonstrate exactly that. The original sentence wasn't what ultimately sent the defendant to prison. It was what happened after the court offered another opportunity. The same reality exists for victims. Once a sentence is imposed, victims often begin a completely different journey. Some find closure. Others continue dealing with emotional trauma long after the courtroom empties. No sentence can erase what happened. The criminal justice system can impose punishment, but it cannot undo the harm caused by a crime. That is one reason victim impact statements have become such an important part of modern sentencing hearings. They remind everyone in the courtroom that criminal cases involve real people, not just legal documents and case numbers. The same applies to families, parents, children, spouses, brothers and sisters. Many have done nothing wrong, yet they still experience the consequences of every conviction. Throughout Judge West's courtroom, one pattern appears repeatedly. Family members often sit silently behind the defendant. Sometimes they hope for probation. Sometimes they expect prison. Sometimes they simply want the uncertainty to end. It's a reminder that criminal cases rarely affect only one person. They ripple through entire families and communities. And for attorneys, the work doesn't necessarily stop either. After sentencing, there may still be appeals, post-conviction motions, or additional hearings depending on the facts of the case. Even when a plea agreement waives certain appellate rights, lawyers continue advising clients about the legal consequences that remain. The courtroom hearing may last only a few minutes. Its consequences can last for decades. Why millions watch these courtrooms? So why have courtroom videos become one of the fastest growing genres on YouTube? The answer isn't simply because people enjoy watching criminal cases. It's because these hearings reveal something rarely seen in everyday life. Every case begins with uncertainty. The defendant doesn't know the outcome. The attorneys don't know exactly how the judge will rule. Even the victims and their families often don't know what to expect until the decision is announced. That uncertainty creates natural suspense. Unlike scripted television, real court proceedings have no writers. No one knows exactly what will happen next. Sometimes a defendant unexpectedly accepts responsibility. Sometimes a witness changes the direction of a hearing. Sometimes a plea agreement falls apart moments before sentencing. Sometimes a judge asks a single question that completely changes the conversation. Those moments feel genuine because they are. But another reason these videos resonate is that they quietly teach viewers how the justice system actually works. Many people don't understand the difference between probation and deferred adjudication. They've never heard of a pre-sentence investigation. They assume bond means innocence, or that pleading guilty guarantees immediate sentencing. Watching real courtroom proceedings helps explain those legal processes in a way textbooks rarely can. Judge West's courtroom has become particularly popular because of her consistent approach. She rarely raises her voice. She doesn't rely on dramatic speeches. Instead, she carefully explains every decision, making sure defendants understand exactly what is happening and why. Whether she's denying bond, rejecting a plea agreement, or accepting a guilty plea, the process remains remarkably consistent. That consistency builds trust with viewers. Even when people disagree with a ruling, they can usually understand the legal reasoning behind it. Perhaps that's the biggest lesson from every case we've explored today. The justice system isn't designed to produce perfect outcomes. It's designed to produce fair ones based on the evidence presented in court. Every hearing reminds us that actions have consequences. Opportunities can be earned. Opportunities can also be lost. And once someone stands before a judge, every decision they've made leading up to that moment becomes part of the story. If today's documentary helped you better understand how these courtroom proceedings work, consider subscribing for more fact-based breakdowns of real criminal cases. Every week, we examine the evidence, explain the legal process, and explore the courtroom moments that continue to shape public conversations about justice. Because behind every headline, there's always a much bigger story.